Good morning and welcome. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. This morning, we're going to be talking about the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, which is the new version of the TPP. And we're going to be talking about its significance and whether the CPTPP. Here to moderate our event this morning is FPRI's Jacques deLisle, who is the director of the Asia program at FPRI. He is also the Stephen A. Cozen Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science and the director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. He'll be speaking with Professor Greg Shaffer, as well as Shihoko Goto from the Wilson Center. Also, a reminder to please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll be going to your questions roughly halfway through the program. I'd also like to, before we get started, say a special thank you to our donors and to our supporters. We couldn't do these programs without you. We will be recording this program and posting it on our YouTube channel, and you can watch it multiple times after the fact and tell your friends. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Jacques deLisle.
Well, thank you, Raleigh, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I apologize for being outdoors here, a bit of a transportation snafu, but I think we'll soldier through. Welcome everyone, thank you for joining us today. I just want to briefly introduce my fellow panelists here. Shihoko, the Deputy Director for the Asia Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center, an old friend of FPRI. She's also Director of Geoeconomics and Indo-Pacific Enterprise at the Wilson Center. Also joining us is Greg Shaffer. Greg is the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine, and President of the American Society for International Law. He's also the author of Emerging Powers and the World Trading System and many other works on topics germane to our discussion today. So I want to first turn to Greg to get us started here, and I'm sure our conversation will get a bit beyond CPTPP, but let's start with CPTPP. It's been around for a little bit now. We now have a possible expansion with applications submitted pretty close to the same time by China, Taiwan, and the United Kingdom. And basically, you've heard a lot about how the WTO is in trouble as the centerpiece of the international trading regime and the broader international economic regime. Is that fair? How much trouble is the WTO in, and what difference does CPTPP make on this front?
Well, first, I'd start with the WTO, Jacques, and thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you. Frankly, the WTO is in severe trouble. And it's in severe trouble because of the geopolitical conflict between China and the United States. Although the United States points its fingers at China for not complying with a rules-based system, it's in fact the United States, not China, that stepped away from the WTO. And fairly, the United States could be viewed, ironically, as the revisionist power with respect to the international trade regime. It's the United States, to quote a member of the WTO Secretariat, who I interviewed, that it was a wrecking ball to the multilateral trade legal order under the presidency of Donald Trump. It is the United States that neutered the WTO appellate body by blocking consensus on the appointment of any new members when the term of the previous member was expiring, such that the appellate body functionally no longer exists. That has ended binding WTO dispute settlement and led to a return to power politics for trade. At the last WTO ministerial meeting, the Biden administration signed off on a ministerial declaration stating that with the WTO members commit to conduct discussions with a view to having a fully and well-functioning dispute settlement system by 2024. However, it seems doubtful to me that this will occur. The United States will likely push to negotiate issues with which other parties find it difficult to agree, such as a self-declaring national security exception to all trade measures. The United States did not like the appellate body decisions that tightened disciplines on import relief law, such as anti-dumping, countervailing duty safeguards, which it used to raise tariffs on Chinese products. There's just no sense to me that the US wants to be constrained by a compulsory, neutral, binding, multilateral dispute settlement system. China's willing to, and it did participate in it very actively, which was actually remarkable. If you think about where we are today, where you could have Russia, Ukraine, and the United States and China litigating their disputes before an international institution, international court. What's interesting to me is that this is the legacy of Donald Trump. Had Hillary Clinton won the presidency, my view is that we would still have compulsory, neutral, binding WTO dispute settlement with an appellate body. But Trump, in the words of a former co-author of mine, Mark Pollack, he was a real change agent. Biden does not feel he can go back and eliminate the Trump tariffs against China and bring back an appellate body. We're almost now 3 years into a Biden presidency, and nothing has changed on trade except that the US has become more strategic and disciplined in its aim to curtail China by first resolving trade spats with its allies so that it's not isolated, but works with them. And then blocking China's access to key technologies, as we've seen with respect to semiconductors. So it appears that trade policy as regards China is now really run out of the National Security Council in the United States, not with the USTR. And I think the same with respect to China. This is now a security relationship with respect to trade. So what about the CPTPP? Let's put it in context. There are 3 major regional blocks today that vary in their economic integration. Europe is 1, North America is the 2nd, and Asia is the 3rd. Europe is the furthest along in terms of economic integration. It's got a common market, a common currency in the Eurozone, and harmonized regulations in many areas. North America, we have now the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which is sort of the successor to NAFTA. Asia, in contrast, is really interesting because it involves a competitive network of FTAs and regional agreements, most notably the RCEP with China and the CPTPP, which is the substitute for the TPP after the US dropped out. So the story of the CPTPP to me is really ironic because it was the US that created the TPP and its expansive coverage with provisions which were targeted at China, right? Many of the negotiated rules in the TPP were tailor-made for China and directly responded to existing WTO jurisprudence, which the US felt unfairly favored China. So for example, on SOEs, the TPP states that SOEs, it defines them by just government control, as opposed to performing a government function, which is contrary to the way the WTO appellate body interpreted this, which meant that US could apply any sort of countervailing duties on any claim that any subsidy given by an SOE to any other Chinese enterprise. It had rules on digital trade, which were very, reflected US preferences on digital trade. It had rules, prohibiting the localization requirements for data and rules prohibiting the transfer of source codes. So all of this, reflected US sort of attempts to basically apply to China, Chinese trade, but it couldn't get multilaterally. So the second irony is that Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore all joined RCEP, which contains none of these rules, right, aimed at constraining Chinese sort of state capitalism, right? It contains none of them. And there was no peep about this of Japan, all of US allies joining this agreement. But now China joining the CPTPP, which does contain these rules, the US doesn't want it to join, right, symbolically. And it'll be difficult, we'll get to this, but it's ironic that they already are members of RCEP, but not of this sort of this agreement that the United States was central in drafting its provisions, which go much beyond RCEP with terms of sort of internal regulatory constraints on how you conduct your economy.
Shaffer? Yeah, I try and unmute here. Sorry, I've been doing this from low-end technology. So, Shihoko, as Greg has said, Japan, interesting place here, right? It was part of the original TPP in which the US was then the largest economy. The US opts out. Japan winds up essentially something like in the driver's seat of the CPTPP, yet it's also in RCEP. So give us a picture of how this looks from Japan and what Japan's stake in this evolving structure of a declining WTO, possibly growing CPTPP and the relatively new RCEP?
Yeah, so it's interesting because Japan was actually the very last country of the original 12 countries to join the TPP in 2013. And there were a number of reasons for Japan to reluctantly join. It really wanted to join first and foremost to have a trade agreement with the United States. It did not have a bilateral, and this was seen as an opportunity to have that, the prize, that bilateral, that relationship, that trade deal with the United States. Secondly, TPP was seen as a tool to ensure Japan's economic relevance. Remember that China overtook Japan as the world's second largest economy in 3 years before Japan joined TPP. And there had been a lot of concern about Japan's standing in the global economic order actually declining. And this was a way for Japan to ensure its relevance and strength. And it also gave it an opportunity to become part of the rule-making mechanism rather than simply following the rules that would come to define the regional economic integration. And thirdly, by joining TPP, Japan could actually ensure that it could pursue painful domestic reform, especially in its agricultural market, but also continue deregulation in the financial sector and the like. Which gives it an easy way out for the Japanese political leadership to say, TPP is making me do all of these incredibly unpopular moves, but this is a painful process, we've got to do it. And it was accepted. It was actually put forward by then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And it actually was seen as heralding a new opportunity for Japan to really step up its game in the global trade, in global trade. Had the United States remained in the TPP, the issues that I just highlighted would have really been the focus area of Japan. So it would have really focused on the economic gains that TPP would have provided, and it would have really focused on the trade facilitation and the trade network that TPP would provide. But as the United States left the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there was, of course, a time when it was expected to collapse. Right, but it was in large part by countries like Japan and Australia that really endeavored to ensure that the remaining 11 countries actually stayed the course, and it ensured that TPP under a new framework called the CPTPP would actually continue and thrive. And what we're seeing is that we not only have had CPTPP signed into a deal, but it is actually thriving. And as you said, Jacques, there are, Taiwan wants to join now. China has put in its official bid, as has the United Kingdom. It's interesting to note from a Japanese perspective that the signing on to TPP, evolving into CPTPP, carrying CPTPP to the finish line. This was all done under the leadership of Prime Minister Abe, who was in government from 2012 to 2020. And it aligned with a bigger vision that Abe had for Japan. It aligned with some of the security ambitions and goals that Japan had for itself to ensure that Japan had a greater presence in the region, but it also ensured that there was a marrying of these political as well as economic interests as well. And I think we've already talked a little bit about RCEP, but it's interesting to see that the United States, as it has backed down from TPP, it has come up with an alternative vision. Instead of joining CPTPP under the Biden administration, it has come up with a new initiative through the Indo-Pacific Economic Partnership. Indo-Pacific economic framework. And for that, Japan has also played an incredibly important role in ensuring that Southeast Asian countries are participating in this new framework that the United States has been pushing forward. So we see an evolution of Japan in its ability not only to be part of the rulemaking process in the trade sphere, but also to ensure that its political will and its political influence actually matches some of the economic interests and economic presence that it has as well. Just one last thing. The excitement about TPP and subsequently CPTPP is, of course, to bring together a large number of like-minded countries, not necessarily democracies, but countries that are willing to work under the rule of law and follow common rules and regulations. And we are also seeing now an emergence of a greater focus on what CPTPP has been focusing on in the service sector and non-tariff issues as well. So at the moment, there is greater unity amongst countries to identify the issues moving forward. They will be in digital trade, they will be in supply chain resilience, and it's also going to be about sustainability in terms of energy and environmental concerns as well. So these are some of the issues that trade agreements will have to look into, and CPTPP is certainly a starting point of that, but there are many alternative visions that are emerging either with or without the United States.
That's both give us a great start on this. I want to loop back to something that Greg alluded to a bit and that Shihoko's comments got into as well, which is if we dial the clock back, Greg, to the day when the WTO was the name of the game and the US was the gatekeeper to the last gatekeeper in effect to China getting into the WTO, there was a belief that the WTO would change China. And as you described the CPTPP, one of its goals was essentially to change or to at least legal obligations to change many of the features of the Chinese economy the US wasn't too keen on. So if we are to imagine a world where maybe China gets into the CPTPP, or at least the CPTPP debate becomes all about China, where are we on the international regime shaping China or China shaping the international regime story?
That's a great question, Jacques. Well, I mean, first of all, in the United States, there's, I think, a assumption that it's become sort of a common trope that the WTO, the attempt to change China, was an utter failure. And I just think that this is mistaken and sort of overblown. The WTO had immense impacts on China. It's clearly, to the extent that anybody believed that somehow joining the WTO would lead to China becoming a sort of a political democracy, that was never, I think, in their hearts, and that certainly would be overblown. The concern is, though, so first of all, maybe I'll just divide the answer in two parts. One, how did it, some of the major impacts that it had on China, and two, how did, with Xi Jinping's assumption of the presidency, how has China sort of shifted its economy in ways which has become more problematic for the United States and other WTO members? So first, it's without a doubt that it changed the mentality of how the Chinese businesses thought about law, thought about trade, organized themselves. I mean, you have major Chinese companies hiring lots of lawyers. You have growth of huge numbers of law firms in Beijing and other cities, which are incredibly impressive. They look like global law firms. They're huge. They have very sophisticated lawyers within them. You have sort of a shift in the Chinese administrative state, where you have sort of a growth of litigation in China. This is between, not just foreigners and Chinese, but primarily between Chinese. who are challenging sort of administrative decision-making, suing each other with respect to intellectual property violations and so forth, with respect to trademarks, patents, copyrights. And so this is a major shift in terms of how China organized its economy. And it was quite successful for China. It became an export powerhouse. China started to sign free trade agreements, sign bilateral investment treaties. It really, with the Belt and Road Initiative, you have sort of a growth of, contracting, transnational contracting, use of arbitration, and so forth. So it's a very different world in China than it was before China joined the WTO. So that's without a doubt. Where there has been shift is there's, certainly President Xi Jinping has put much more focus on state-owned enterprises as sort of the leading forces in the Chinese economy. And he's also sort of, pushed for requirements that, there have to be Communist Party members and cells and, and all significant private companies in China. So there's a sense of much greater sort of state assertion of control over the economy than there was before in terms of a capitalist model. And this has raised concerns in the United States and elsewhere that sort of that the Chinese economy, in terms of sort of subsidization and the lack of transparency, it's just very difficult to one, have Americans and foreign companies feel security and predictability when they invest in China, feel security and predictability with respect to their technology, the protection of their technology, and then finally, just with respect to the fairness of trade globally, given the ability for the Chinese state, it was felt to subsidize through state-owned enterprises and otherwise. So this has been part of the TPP was all about sort of placing greater constraints on China. And I think this would be, I'd be really interested in terms of Shihoko's views with respect to Japan, is that whether or not one can really trust that this, if were China to join the CPTPP, what sort of impact would it have on sort of China's use of state-owned enterprises, China's subsidization policies, sort of the subsidization policies that can lead to sort of overcapacity in the production of certain products, leading to real sort of constraints on production around the world in steel, aluminum, and other key products. And so, the goal of China joining the CPTPP was to try, and in fact, in terms of what Shihoko said about Japan, to empower those pressing for reform inside the state, to facilitate reform in this direction. But I think there's a real lack of trust now with respect to the ability of an international agreement to have that sort of impact in China. And that's a very different view than I think was a more optimistic view in the 2000s when China joined the WTO.
Yeah, thanks. Terrific set of points there. So I'd say just, Greg and I both watched this back when it was happening, China entering the TPP, entering the WTO, and Shihoko did too, of course. And there was a lot of optimism, and as Greg points out, there was a lot of change. But just this week, we're seeing, in a sense, a doubling down on the less market-friendly, less international rule-accepting approach in China. Nothing earth-shattering in the way of news, but we're seeing it sort of more deeply embedded at the party Congress going on. I've been hearing for a while, but even louder about how China offers a different path to development for humanity, about how a more regulated and orderly economy is the way to go, even if it means shutting down for COVID for a while, and that state-directed innovation is perhaps the path. So I want to throw this back to Shihoko, taking up some of those points that Greg raised and also that Shihoko raised earlier. And I guess really sort of two things to throw at you at this point. One is, how do you react to Greg's point about if China gets into the CPTPP, and if it continues behavior that many other members of the WTO have seen as non-conforming, or at least foot-dragging, and perhaps even rule-shaping in ways that are at odds with what is a kind of gold standard liberal agreement, is the way the CPTPP is often defined. How does that look from Japan? It's question one. And question two is, how has the Japanese parallel to China entering the WTO worked out in the CPTPP? That is, do we see reforms in Japan along the lines that you described? As Greg's written about and I've written about on China, part of the point of getting into the WTO was for reformers in China to force through these changes. And we don't want to lose sight of that success story because of the complaints we have now. So let me just throw this to you, Shihoko, the view from Japan about what it means if China gets in, what does it mean for the principles of the CPTPP, and is the Abe era project of changing Japan through membership in this kind of pact making progress?
Yeah, so I think it's important to step back and look at CPTPP as it was then and how CPP is perceived now. When Japan joined, again, this was first and foremost an economic policy decision. Today, it would probably be less so, and it's actually become a political conundrum because it's dealing with this challenge of accession requests both from China and Taiwan, and the obvious issue of are we going to take that WTO route and ensure that both Beijing and Taipei join simultaneously, or are we going to have China join first, or are we going to have Taiwan join first, and what are the consequences of that? And so this is the big challenge that Japan has had. And I would also add that Japan is a very reluctant leader in this. And so any conversation you have with the Japanese in a public forum, they will always go back and say the United States needs to come back. The door is always open. Washington, we're waiting for you. And so that is the message that you continue to hear. And then the other thing that, as Greg said, WTO did not change the behavior of China, but I think there was a lot of expectation that it would. When it comes to the possibility of China joining the CPTPP, on the other hand, don't think there's a lot of expectation for China to change its behavior. Rather, the concern is what kind of influence would China have for behavioral change amongst the member countries and some of the rules that might change as a result of China joining the agreement. The focus area of Japan for now is not about market access. It really is not. As I said, one of the biggest goals of Japan to join the CPTPP initially was to have a trade agreement with the United States. It has subsequently had a bilateral trade agreement with the United States just focused on goods. And right now, the concern for Japan is less about the friction over the auto industry, auto parts, auto exports, which makes up about 70% of the trade imbalance of Japan with the United States. But rather, it is about dealing with this growing, as Greg said, about the National Security Council being the driving force of trade policy rather than USTR. So some of the lessons learned from a US perspective of the double whammy of a pandemic and this systemic rise of China is to hunker down on seeing China as a threat. What kind of economic policies and trade policies can be pursued to ensure that that threat is mitigated, if not completely put down at this stage. So we're seeing the United States take on very protectionist measures and focusing on making its own key industries, especially in the semiconductor industry, but also in critical minerals, long-term batteries, high-capacity batteries, and the like. And these are issues where the Japanese are very invested in the United States, but they are also very concerned about some of the measures that could block them from engaging, not only investing further or partnering with US companies, but now increasingly doing business in China and elsewhere and being seen as a threat because of some of the unilateral decisions that the United States is taking and imposing it on member fellow allies and partner countries, including Japan. So this is going to be the big challenge for Japan. So there's this whole issue of dealing with the China challenge, but also dealing with the US challenge as well.
So we've touched upon several times the heavy political dimension to what were essentially initially supposed to be trade and economic foci to these kind of trade agreements. And we can go through the arc, particularly of the U.S. engagement here. Originally was going to again change China. In the most robust views, it would change China internally, as Greg knows. But short of that, China would come into compliance with the generally liberal norms of the international system, and the WTO would gradually spread beyond trade and goods and services to more and more stuff, and the CPTPP is taken into the new areas and all of that. And then we heard for a while, indeed heard with the original TPP, statements from the US that this is a contest between the US and China over who will write the rules of the international economy for the 21st century. Very different tone. And now, as you both pointed out, it's kind of, well, the US isn't so sure it's on board with a lot of that liberalism because it feels the rules are working better for China than it is for the US. So let's engage a little protectionism, a little decoupling. So, what's going what's the agenda going forward to? We've talked about securitization, and I'd welcome further comments on that. But the other political thing that has come up in the CPTPP is Taiwan and its application for membership. So I'd like to turn a little bit to that, and then also want to turn to the IPEF eventually. But I also want to encourage our audience to put questions in the Q&A box because we will be turning to that soon. So Shihoko, what's the view on the Taiwan issue in Japan? Clearly vexing. Clearly, Japan has, on the Taiwan issue in general, moved considerably in the last several years from kind of keeping a distance to, at least on the security side, bundling the Taiwan issue into its own security. I had expectation that the clash over Taiwan would involve the US and Japan pretty quickly. Yet we don't, I think, see much hope for a very short-term entry of Taiwan or China, for that matter, into the CPTPP. So how is Japan negotiating that? The UK is a little less controversial, but how do you handle how is Japan going to approach the joint applications? Of course, in the WTO context, we saw, as I think you alluded to earlier, a complicated deal which wound up with essentially a joint accession, but with the face-saving measure of China getting in before Taiwan. What's the path forward, if any, in the CPTPP applications?
Yeah, so from Japan's perspective, and I am not a Abe supporter, but I do want to recognize some of the agenda setting that he was very successful in the foreign policy front. And so he was seen as one of the first people to push for the Indo-Pacific, right? So he talked about the conversions of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and this was a speech that he gave when he was first prime minister in India. And then he started talking about TPP and the need for economic integration and cooperation in the region, and this was one of the platforms to do so. And then once he left office in 2020, it wasn't really the Indo-Pacific he focused on. It wasn't really TPP or CPTPP that he focused on. His biggest concern and his biggest push and the most public speeches he gave and policy briefs that he gave was about Taiwan. And he talked about, here is this like red line. This is going to be the test of American commitment to the region, how it deals with Taiwan, what kind of engagement the United States is prepared to give to Taiwan, and in turn, what does that mean for Japan's own security and economic resilience as well? And so he actually made a point of ensuring that Japan would staunchly support the accession of Taiwan even before China as well. It was seen as a very controversial position in Japan, even though Japanese political leaders by and large are very supportive of Taiwan. But they also know that that kind of support for Taiwan comes with a heavy price. And that heavy price is the wrath of China. To date, there hasn't really been that much of a backlash in terms of economic coercion or otherwise by Japan's continued support for Taiwanese accession into the CPTPP. However, within Japan, there continues to be very strong concern about some of the negative consequences of Japan actually being so strongly supportive of Taiwanese accession. So there is that political dilemma, and I do think that Japan's strategy from here on out is to, one, get the UK on board fairly soon, as quickly as it can, as a measure to actually stabilize Britain and also to ensure that Japanese investments in Europe, which still continue to use the UK as its launch pad, remain steady. But when it comes to the accession of China and Taiwan, the strategy will be to kick the can as far along as it can, in the hopes that eventually the United States will join and it will pick up that can and do something about it. And I think that for right now, under the Prime Minister Suga's administration, has a number of priorities, including the situation regarding Taiwan, but it is less about Taiwan and CPTPP entry. It is much more about the security aspect of Taiwan as well. So we will see Japan supporting Taiwan in industry specific or in specific issues. Yes, semiconductors, we've already seen a lot of partnerships between direct investment by TSMC into Japan. There is this talk about the the Fab 4 alliance between Japan, the United States, Korea, and Taiwan. So we are seeing a movement forward to have Taiwan be an integral part of the rulemaking process in specific industries. But I don't think there's going to be any significant change or shift when it comes to Taiwan joining CPTPP.
Okay, thanks. I want to turn back to a couple of these questions. So the question of Taiwan's accession, how important is it for Taiwan to get in? What does it mean for a country like Taiwan, or a trading entity like Taiwan, to be in or out of something like the CPTPP from an economic perspective? That's sort of the Taiwan question. And then the follow-on question I want to pose to you, Greg, is one of the appeals of the WTO as a successor to GATT was that it was going to have this robust dispute resolution mechanism. That's been hamstrung largely by the US. The CPTPP has a somewhat similar structure for binding neutral dispute resolution. Is that going to function well once we see the CPTPP going forward and perhaps expanding to include parties whose compliance may be less than ideal?
Well, so first of all, with respect to Taiwan, I mean, it goes without saying that Taiwan would love to join the CPTPP just politically, right? Being recognized as sort of a player in the global economy. It'd be very important just politically. But also, I just think economically it's important for Taiwan. I mean, it'd help it to diversify its economy. We've been talking about computer chips, but a large part of Taiwan's economy is computer chips. It'd be nice for it to diversify its economy in this way in terms of expanding its Asian trade, and also to diversify its economy from being less dependent on China. So economically, I think it'd be quite important for it to join. Remember, already around, I think it's about 25%, about a quarter of Taiwan's trade is with CPTPP's countries. And so entering the bloc could help to expand its trade further. But I think it's going to be very difficult for Taiwan to join, even if to join jointly with China. I mean, remember 20 years ago when China joined the WTO, it wasn't really in a place as like it is today to challenge Taiwan. Now China will work, I think, much harder to block Taiwan from joining, just given the rise of nationalism and Chinese nationalism. It's turned to a more aggressive foreign policy. I think it'd be more challenging to have a joint entry than it was 20 years ago when they both joined the WTO, as you noted. What was your second question, Jacques? The dispute settlement. So dispute settlement, it'll be interesting to see because there are countries which have agreed to have binding dispute settlement in the WTO. China has, the European Union has, Australia has, and so forth, Brazil. And we have our first case now before sort of an appellate mechanism, arbitration mechanism in the WTO itself. So these countries, they still have the possibility of potentially using WTO dispute settlements. So if the Biden administration continues after 2024 to block to the creation of binding compulsory dispute settlement at WTO, I mean, clearly that's a huge loss, but I think more countries will have to question whether or not they're going to want to enter into this to the EU, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, China, sort of, and other countries' mechanisms for dispute settlement, Australia, and so forth. CPTPP, to the extent that it goes further because it reduces tariffs to a much greater extent and contains other rules, possibly, but you know, these countries weren't the major users of the WTO dispute settlement system in the first place. Japan has always been, sort of given the size of the Japanese economy, an underperformer in terms of just use of the WTO dispute settlement system, so it's an outlier. Will, you know, these countries use this? I think it's more of a question mark, just because I think Asian countries sort of more broadly have been less likely to use WTO dispute settlement. If you look at even China, you know, China's never really brought disputes against anybody besides the US and Europe. So it doesn't resolve its trade disputes with other CPTP members currently through the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. So were it to join, I think there'd be serious questions whether or not this would be as active of a dispute settlement system as the WTO was in its heyday.
So Shihoko, let me throw that last thread back to you, which is, does the CPTPP's robust court-like dispute resolution system, is that a factor for Japan? Part of it, as Greg pointed out, is not a high user of the system. On the other hand, you know, like any quasi-common law court, these decisions do shape the rules and shape the environment in which these states operate, and negotiations are conducted in the shadow of the prospect that someone will bring a case, but you know, pretty indirect stuff. So how big a deal is, for good or for ill, for, you know, making it appealing or unappealing, is the CPTPP's dispute resolution system for Japan?
So for Japan, I think it's interesting that Greg pointed out that Japan is an underuser of the mechanism in the WTO. And when the conversation debate about Japan joining the CPTPP board, some of the aspects that raised a lot of controversy within Japan had been about dispute resolution mechanisms, but it hadn't actually figured too highly in the Japanese public. And I think today that kind of expectation for Japan to actually continue to use it will not really be part of that conversation for now. I think Jacques come back.
Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough. All right, so I wanted so just back to the Taiwan thread that we're talking about. Sorry, it seemed to have been in my video. Back to Taiwan, so we're talking about. In some ways, Taiwan would seem to be in relatively good shape for getting in, right? We do have an area where the CPTPP, like the WTO and unlike the UN, is not a states member-only organization. It's economics focused rather than political focused. It's an area where Taiwan's exclusion sort of makes the regime less complete given its role in the regional and global economy and all that. So it should look promising, but as you both pointed out, not too darn likely. And I think, as Greg suggested, it's a measure of both China's clout and China's determination to shrink Taiwan's face. And again, something we've seen re-emphasized at today's this week's Party Congress in China. So one of the questions is therefore, what can the US and Japan do to support Taiwan's engagement in the sustained role in the global economy? Some of that takes care of itself, as you pointed out, by the importance of TSMC and semiconductor manufacturing. Everybody wants that to work, and there are various workarounds. But one of the things that was sort of offered was IPEF, right? The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and we saw kind of the same dynamic of the US not pushing for Taiwan's inclusion because of the concern about reaction from China and whatever China might do to press other potential members. So there's this talk of this kind of workaround to get Taiwan some of the benefit of IPEF without being in it. So, Shihoko, would you care, or Greg, either one of you care to speak to that, and how will these kinds of things work? And it's partly a Taiwan question, but it's also partly a general question about the complexity we see out there now that we have multiple organizational structures and lots of informal bilateral things going on. Is that a way of trying to keep the regional and global economy integrated despite all the problems we've been talking about? So let me throw that first to Shihoko and then to Greg.
Yeah, so 2 points. One is Taiwan has done a lot to be accession ready. I think with great political costs, the Taiwan government opened its market to US pork. And that had been a tremendous stumbling block for the United States, for other countries in accessing the Taiwanese agricultural market. Taiwan actually lifted some of its restrictions on importing foods from Japan's Fukushima area as well, and despite some domestic concerns about food safety. So those are some of the steps that Taiwan has taken so that it can be part of both CPTPP and IPEF. But it is clear that it's very difficult even for Taiwan to be part of larger multilateral trade groups, even if they're supported and initiated by the United States. And if you look at the case of IPEF, we focus on the fact that the United States had the separate separate agreement with Taiwan without having Taiwan be part of the actual main IPEF agreement itself. But I should note that that was because had the United States insisted on Taiwan joining, then the other Southeast Asian countries would have not wanted to join. So it was almost a self-censorship on the part of the United States, not from fear of retaliation from China, but rather the goal here was to have as many countries join IPEF as possible, especially from Southeast Asia, especially countries not necessarily obvious partners for the United States. And IPEF succeeded in doing that. And had Taiwan been included, then most of the ASEAN countries would have definitely not been part of it, and other countries too would have been very hesitant to be part of it. So that kind of fear of China by other countries still remains this tremendous stumbling block for Taiwan.
Yeah, Greg, do you want to weigh in on any of these things?
Well, sure. I mean, that was a great point regarding the ASEAN countries and the reason why the United States didn't go forward with IPEF, including Taiwan and IPEF. I think one, we should just say, what was impressive about IPEF is they got many more countries I think many of us expected to join, by getting Indonesia in, by getting Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, these are big ASEAN economies, the Philippines, Singapore. That was a success. But I think we should also say it's really unclear, what IPEF is going to actually bring. Certainly, there's not much talk about market access involving IPEF. Notice it's called a framework. We stumbled over with Indo-Pacific economic. It's not agreement. It's not partnership. It's a framework, right? It's a framework with 4 pillars where everybody has a choice in terms of which pillars they're going to join. But it's really not quite clear what precisely is going to be in the pillars in terms of anything besides some soft law undertakings. And so, no binding dispute settlement, it looks like, no necessarily binding requirements, and so forth. But let's say that they do have something which is a bit more binding on the digital economy or something like that, which would be, important in the marketplace. I think that it'd be easy. Taiwan doesn't need to be a formal member to basically, be a shadow member. In other words, you can think about the EU, the shadow effects of those countries outside the EU. The EU passes a new regulation. If you want your products to be able to enter into the EU, you better think about enacting something like that regulation as part of your domestic law. Switzerland does this all the time. This is to be able to engage in trade with its largest trading partner, the EU. I would imagine one can think about Taiwan following very carefully any developments in IPEF and these 4 pillars, and basically as a shadow, just doing exactly what is required. And then, if the countries which are friendly with Taiwan will, enable Taiwan to benefit from these measures on a reciprocal basis. So I think that's probably the type of workaround that we will actually see.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And it's very much part of the Taiwan repertoire for dealing with its marginalization. I mean, it's this sort of as-if participation. So they adopt domestically things that track the UN covenants on human rights. They adopt things domestically that track WTO before they're allowed to enter. So too with climate change and any number of other areas. It's a twofer because it as Greg pointed out, particularly in the trade and economic sector, it sort of creates harmonization approaches that mean being outside the system isn't as jarring, and it also creates the status bump of say, hey, look, we're behaving just like a member. So I think it is something we'll very much see in the repertoire. So one of the things that came in the Q&A box essentially is asking us to plunk. How much of the opposition to China's joining the CPTPP is political and how much is economic? That is, how much of it is a concern that China won't play by the rules and therefore will undermine the functioning of the institution, or at least won't be changed enough to make the costs of entry coming in, and how much of it is essentially fallout from the rising tensions sharply between the US and China, but also greater wariness toward China politically, security-wise, in the region. So I'll throw that to you, Greg, first. What do you think?
Sure. So, well, I got to say, I'm going to punt in the sense of saying this, both the two are interrelated. Okay. So, I mean, we live now in a world in which politics, geopolitics is sort of, determining trade policy. And so for China to join the CPTPP would be a major symbolic and strategic victory for China, right? And simply the United States and others want to deny China that sort of symbolic strategic victory. Economically, though, China would like to be the economic hub of this agreement, right? The economic hub of the original TPP was the United States. It would have been the largest economy in the agreement. Now, in this free trade area, the largest economy would be China. That would make China, its goal is to be a hub through the Belt and Road Initiative, but now you've got this great Pan-Asian, Pan-Pacific agreement where it's the hub. It helped to consolidate economically its growing dominance in the Asia-Pacific region and beyond. That, of course, has political implications because the stronger China is economically, the more leverage it exercises over others. It put China at the center of regional and global supply chains, where the United States policy has tried to decouple China from these supply chains. And so I think that the political and the economic actually are tied. China would benefit from joining this agreement in a significant way. And that's the reason why, in a geopolitical context, there's going to be great pressure to not have China join.
Okay, Shihoko.
Yeah, I think when China first raised its hand to officially join, there was a lot of criticism that China was doing this to spite the United States. I think that kind of sentiment does prevail, especially in Washington. From a perspective, like a Japanese perspective, would be that one of the biggest goals of CPTPP still remains to ensure that the United States joins the pact. And if China were to do so before the United States, that really does kill that possibility. So when we talk about the geopolitical risks, that's certainly one. So you cannot have China join before the United States, especially in this current political climate. That said, the choice is never about decoupling from China, right? It depends on the degree of separation and which industries and what are the alternatives. And so we take that semiconductor example, and I think Taiwan has had a really good practice with China, so they can cooperate and invest in China on the low end chips, but not in the high end. And this is what the United States is trying to do with its export restrictions. There isn't a lot of clarity at the moment. I don't think the CPTPP as it currently stands would actually be any help in defining what critical assets are and what the technology sharing rules should and should not be. So we are seeing opportunities for greater cooperation and certainly a need for greater clarity on where we can actually, what assets are, where the cooperative opportunities are, and where there has to be this divergence when it comes to engagement.
Okay, and lest I be accused of ducking the question that I posed, I'll say, yeah, I think it is within an interactive way. And what we've seen, I think, is a real shift, particularly in US-China relations, from the belief that deepening economic interdependence would be a foundation for a broader, better relationship, perhaps even politically, but certainly economically and reducing risk of security threats, into ones where everybody stopped reading Cohen and Nye and started reading Hirschman. That is the risk that economic dependence creates political leverage and perhaps even national security threats. And we've seen this, look at the cut-off supply of chips to Russia. China is very much mindful of technological self-sufficiency. We've just seen the latest round of high-tech limitations from the Biden administration. There is a sense of the weaponization of asymmetrical economic interdependence that drives a lot of it. So I think it is some of both. So the final question we got in the Q&A, running up against time here. The simple form would be, what are the prospects for the US joining CPTPP, getting back in? And the more complicated form is, given the difficulty of getting any kind of trade agreement like this through the US political process, how does the US pursue its goals if it is left or leaves itself on the outside? First to Shihoko, and then Greg gets the last word.
All right, so I'm going to start with the good news. I think IPEF is here to stay. I think it will weather not just the Biden administration, but whatever administration that succeeds it, whether it's a Republican one or a Democratic one, precisely because it is so unbinding and lacks details, as Greg pointed out. There hasn't been a lot of opposition on the Hill to IPEF, as we have seen regarding TPP. There isn't a lot for Americans to be pushing back against. So this is an opportunity for the United States to continue to be part of the world's largest, most economically dynamic region, but at the same time, not have to commit, not have to change. It requires very little from the United States. So there's that. And then when it comes to this issue of CPTPP, it can always turn to IPEF and say, yes, well, this is the strategy for the United States to remain a Pacific economic power. And there is no need for CPTPP as it is. One final thing, the Biden administration, for all its rhetoric about cooperation and engagement, it really hasn't lifted any of the trade tariffs that had been imposed by the Trump administration. There hadn't been as much discussion ahead of time regarding IPEF either. There is a lot of concern about the United States not necessarily being as strategic as it can be when it comes to working with its partners and allies. And I think this not joining CPTPP is going to be yet another lost opportunity for the United States.
Okay,
and we're coming up against time here, but Greg, you get the last word.
Okay, so that was, I agree with everything Shihoko said, and it was quite fascinating because I think this is the best the world's going to get from the United States in time to come. If you get a Trumpian populist as president, it's not going to look anything like what it looks like right now in terms of consultation with allies. But 2 points, with the CPTPP, there's just no chance, I think, that US would join it. Everything in the rhetoric here in Washington is this to be a worker-centered trade policy. No one quite knows what that means, except it probably means no market access commitments and continued tariffs, including at times on allies. The Biden has been, biding its time. It's friendlier with allies generally on trade, but it's, everything's now is geostrategic as we started off vis-a-vis China. But this geostrategic strategy is also constrained by US domestic politics. So you could make the point that joining the TPP would be good geostrategic strategy for the United States. But the Republican Party is now dominated by Trumpist populists. The Democratic Party is worried about the white working class vote. The result is the TPP can no longer be part of US geostrategic strategy as it was.
And it's probably worth pointing out in closing, the TPP was in some trouble even before the 2016 election. You had, although I think it would have been a very different result, the Hillary Clinton presidency probably would have found a way to tweak it to get it through, and Trump was more profoundly opposed. But it is part of a long drift in that direction, which makes it difficult to do things which might be quite sensible in the national and perhaps even the global interest. Thank you both for joining us. This has been a terrifically rich discussion. Thank you, Shihoko Goto from the Wilson Center and a longtime friend of FPRI. Thank you, Greg Shaffer. You've seen references to both their works in the box, and I especially want to thank Greg because I know he is absolutely swamped being president of the American Society for International Law. We thank you for your service on that front. We thank you all for joining us today. Please stay tuned for further events in our Asia program. We have a lot coming up focusing on geoeconomics, China and the economy and things like that. So we hope you'll join us for that and many other topics as well. Again, see you soon, and thank everyone, especially Greg and Shihoko.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jacques.